Chapter 18, Renewing the Sectional Struggle 1848 to 1854. This chapter really covers the aftermath of the Mexican-American War and how the United States government deals with the land it obtains from Mexico. And there's a huge fight between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery forces. And you can really see that this is the build-up, and we're getting closer and closer to war. By the end of this chapter, even though the people of the time didn't know it, you'll probably have the feeling that the Civil War is inevitable at this time period. So it's a very important chapter in regards to the causes of the Civil War, which is a very, very commonly covered topic both in essay form and in multiple choice portion of the AP test. A central theme throughout this chapter is the doctrine of popular sovereignty, and it was a compromise, really a political compromise. And what do we do to resolve the slavery issue that's going to be fairest for everyone, with the exception of slaves, obviously. And the doctrine of popular sovereignty states that the people of a territory, so these are people who live in a territory that's not a state, they themselves should determine the status of slavery. So it shouldn't matter if you're north or south of 36 degrees 30 longitude, which is the Missouri Compromise. It shouldn't matter if you're in the Old Northwest or the Louisiana Purchase or the old Mexican lands. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't be decided for you. It should be the people of the territory. So the public liked it because it gave self-determination. Politicians liked it because it was politically, they were able to get the other side to at least accept it, even if it wasn't the decision that the other side wanted. Alright, General Taylor. So you remember the two major generals in the Mexican-American War were Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready, and Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. Right? The two guys with the coolest nicknames in American military, at least for this course. They're going to play a big part in a political aspect in this chapter. But before we talk about President Zachary Taylor, we're going to talk about the Free Soil Party. It's almost like a single issue party. They're anti-slavery, and they kind of pop up at the very, very end of the 1840s, almost out of nowhere. So they support the Wilmot Proviso. When the Wilmot Proviso was a bill that never becomes a law, and it stated that any lands that we are able to obtain from the Mexican-American War, regardless of their location, should be free of slavery. So obviously the Free Soil Party is in favor of that. In fact, that's basically the name, Free Soil, what it means. So who becomes Free Soil Party members? Industrialists who are angry at Polk's reduction of the protective tariff. So they were from the Northeast. They want that protective tariff to protect their industrial interests. And Democrats who are angry at Polk for splitting the difference in Oregon and yet taking all of Texas. Part of the decisions that his administration made is they annexed all of Texas. Remember, at the end of the day, it really was John Tyler in the last few days of his presidency that gets Texas, but I guess these Free Soil members either forgot or overlooked that. Whereas Polk was very diplomatic, we'll say. They split the difference with Oregon. Now again, I'm going to defend Polk here. He didn't decide Texas, and even if he did, we're taking Texas from a fairly weak Mexico, as opposed to Oregon, which the beef with Oregon wasn't with Mexico, it was with Great Britain, who was the strongest military in the world, and who were just slowly becoming friends with at this point. So from a diplomatic standpoint, being somewhat more cautious and equality with Britain is going to make sense here. It also attracts conscious Whigs, your book states, who are morally against slavery. And then there's other people who are against slavery, not because they were pro-black. It was more because they felt that poor whites in the factories were actually competing with the cheaper slave labor. I'm not real sure what the logic is of that one, because there wasn't slaves working in the factories. But they felt that if there was no slavery, then the whites in the factories would be paid more and treated better. again, I don't agree with the logic of that, but hey, that's what they believed. So General Zachary Taylor of Mexican-American War fame, he runs on the Whig Party ticket, and he wins the election of 1848, really with absolutely no platform whatsoever. Um, all he did, all the people who ran him and publicly supported him, the Whig Party really didn't state what they were into or what his beliefs were. He was just a very famous figure because of the war, and they wanted it in the White House, and it worked. They got in. This is a cartoon from your book, and it shows General Zachary Taylor with the blood dripping sword, and he's able to make his name and make his fame and give the Whigs power, seated on a mountain of Mexican skulls. So that's what you should read into that one. All right, California. So very, very shortly, I think it was like 2 weeks or something like that, before the end of the Mexican-American War, they find gold at Sutter's Mill, right here. So here's San Francisco, so we're in Northern California. Here are the Sierra Nevada mountains, and you can see all these rivers that start off in the mountains, and they work their way down to the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and dump into San Francisco Bay. Well, these rivers, over the eons, had picked up gold bits from deep in the mountains, and they find gold at Sutter's Mill. Remember, this is the time period where California was the Golden Bear Flag Republic or something like that. And so technically they were independent, but really they were just waiting for the end of the war to become part of America. Uh, Finding gold at Sutter's Mill creates gold fever, and you see thousands of people from all over the United States head to California as quickly as they possibly can to make their fortunes mining gold. I kind of like the names of these places. Dutch Flat, you bet. You can see Rough and Ready. That must have been named for Zachary Taylor. Chinese Camp, Negro Bar, God's Country. I mean, these are interesting names. This is an actual photo of some of the earliest gold miners there in 1848, 1849. And you just you got a pile of mud from the stream, or dirt or rocks, and you just kind of stuck it in this sluice box, I think it's called, and it's just filled with water, and then you kind of just sift out the big stuff, and then you take a pan down here, and you swirl it around, you look for gold bits. So California actually has enough people within a year to apply for statehood, and so they don't go through the normal process, which usually took several years, because they were just already bursting with population. They kind of just they drafted up their constitution and said, "Let us in." Well, their constitution forbade slavery, and this makes sense because it's not the people who are moving to California aren't moving there to plant cotton or tobacco. They're not forming plantations. They're going there to mine gold or to create these little mining camps. So these almost like these little villages of like stores. Uh, so like hardware stores, banks, stuff like that to actually aid the miners in their the mining. So none of this involves slavery. So there's it's just not economically something that the Californians were into. Now, the South goes nuts over this, though, because most of California, if you look at a map, is located below 36 degrees 30. That's the line from the Missouri Compromise. President Zachary Taylor, remember, he's one of the generals in the Mexican-American War. So he's, a militarist, maybe an expansionist. Remember, the Whigs are pretty silent. The Whigs, for the most part, are anti-slavery, not completely. Uh, and so he supports getting California into the fold. If California wants to be free, that's cool with the president. In addition to that, there's some other disputes that are happening during this time period. So I have here the California question, and it's because the South would then lose their equality in the Senate. At this time, prior to California, there were 15 slave states and 15 free states. So if California comes in, then there would be 16 free states. There's a border dispute between Texas and the New Mexico territories. You can see here, Texas originally claimed all of this land. And remember, it was an independent country, so for 10 years it felt it had this land. And that's most of New Mexico, right? And a huge portion of Colorado, a little bit of Kansas, and some Wyoming there. New Mexico territory obviously doesn't think that this is fair. There's also calls for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. Now, this is problematic for the South because north of Washington, D.C. is Maryland, which was a slave state, and south of Washington, D.C. is Virginia, which is a slave state. So the South were very upset at the prospect of having a free city surrounded by slaves, because they felt that the slaves would just flee to the city. Think ahead, and if you remember last year from world history, during the Cold War in Germany, right? There was East Germany and West Germany, and then Berlin was completely inside East Germany, and yet half of Berlin was West Germany. So they had the bad guys, right? The commies had built the Berlin Wall around the west portion of Berlin, and yet East Germans every year were trying to scale the wall, dig under the wall, basically sneak into West Berlin to be free. So this is what the South feared themselves 100 years earlier. Now, the South is also upset that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, so it's been on the books for over 50 years now, wasn't strong enough. It was only kind of half-heartedly followed in the North, and so the slaves had a chance. It was a fairly remote chance, but had a chance to flee all the way to Canada, and they wouldn't get caught. And if you make it to Canada, then it's a foreign country, and they're free forever. So because of all these issues, the South threatens secession. Right? And this is, you start, the biggest advocate of this was probably John C. Calhoun, but a lot of the major political leaders from the South, and it's not really Virginia, it's more the deeper South, the South Carolina areas down there, that they're really pushing for this. So along comes Henry Clay, and Henry Clay is an extremely old man now. We've been talking about Henry Clay for several chapters now. Remember, the first time we talked about Henry Clay was that he was a young war hawk in Congress, advocating for a war in the War of 1812. Now, he's still alive now in 1850. It seems like he's run for president every single election and has always lost. He's like the Ted Kennedy of the day. John McCain would be another comparison. But despite the fact that he never becomes president, Henry Clay really put his mark on legislation for the first half of the 1800s. And he should be given credit for a lot of the economic gains, the diplomatic gains, and he attempted to avert a civil war. At the end of the day, he's not going to be successful, but at the time he didn't know that, and really the Civil War doesn't start until long after his death. So maybe if he was still alive, he could have averted the Civil War because of his power and prestige in the federal government, specifically in the Congress. So here's Henry Clay's master plan. California should be admitted as a free state because that's what the Californians want. So that's a one for the side of the North, I guess. Now, to give the South something, they should get a more effective fugitive slave law. Then what do you do with that other territory from Mexico that we got? Well, this is where the idea of popular sovereignty comes in. You let the New Mexico and Utah territories decide the slavery issue themselves. So even though this is desert and you're not growing crops out there, it still leaves the possibility open to the South that if they want to move there with a bunch of slaves, that it'll be a slave state. In addition to that, Texas borders are shortened, but they get $10 million to go towards their debt that they had incurred uh, in their fight against Santa Anna several years before. And there's a picture of Henry Clay apparently making his speeches there in the House. You can see the only one I recognize here is a very angry John C. Calhoun sitting there. I think Daniel Webster's somewhere. So there's crazy ass John C. Calhoun. Basically looks like a giant Halloween decoration, and yet he's one of the most powerful Americans of all time. But we're going to talk about Stephen A. Douglas for the first time. He is a young senator from the great state of Illinois. He's kind of a midget. He was real short, 5'2", 3, 4, something like that. But he was called the Little Giant because he obviously had a Napoleonic complex and kind of puffed out his chest and spoke real loud and was, gained a certain amount of fame as a result. Now, Millard Fillmore, who was President Zachary Taylor's vice president, Millard Fillmore, you remember, as one of the roles of a vice president is to be the president of the Senate. And so he was sitting in on all of these compromise negotiations and debates in Congress. Well, President Taylor dies. So Millard Fillmore becomes president, and he was very, very well versed on these issues. And Taylor himself was not a real big supporter of a lot of the stuff. And so it was kind of, it changed the game. Taylor's death changed the game because Fillmore was much more in favor of passing all these compromise bills. Probably the biggest thing that aids in the passage of these bills is the death of John C. Calhoun, because he was anti anything that would help the North and hurt the South. But this is Mr. Nullification himself. He also starts his career as a war hawk during the War of 1812. So he was vice president at least once or twice. He had a long history himself of not being president, but being very, very influential, powerful figure during this time period, and he was the face and the voice of the South. Because of his death, opposition really kind of collapses in the South, and so the provisions eventually become law. And really, the Compromise of 1850, the clear winner is the North, and we'll talk about that why. Now, here's where we're going to talk. This is the last slide of Henry Clay. In fact, this is an actual photograph of Henry Clay, or a daguerreotype, I guess, shortly before his death. Also not a looker, kind of creepy looking. His nickname was the Great Compromiser. Remember, he is the father of the American system, which is no small feat in and of itself. He'd probably be very famous just for that. Remember, after the death of Alexander Hamilton, America needed a new economic guru to set us on the right path, and that guy becomes Henry Clay. He's also the architect of the Missouri Compromise, which was in effect for over 30 years. He peacefully ends the nullification crisis of 1833. He keeps Andrew Jackson from starting a civil war and killing everybody in South Carolina. And the last great thing that he does is the architect of the Compromise of 1850, which forestalls civil war for another 10 years. He finally dies in 1852, so no more compromising. Now we're going to go over these provisions, and a big one is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This is pro-South. It's definitely pro-South, and it was a horrible law because the deck was so stacked against a runaway slave. Even if he wasn't even a runaway slave, he could just be a freeborn African American. The deck is still stacked against him. And the reason why is the individual was not entitled to a trial by jury. only the judge would decide the case. Not only that, but the defendant, so this would be the African American, was not even allowed to testify. So he can't even, give evidence on his own behalf. And a statement by the slave owner was all the evidence that was needed. Now the slave owner didn't even need to be there. Just a letter saying, "Yeah, that's my guy," was good enough. And if that's not bad enough, judges received $5 if the runaway was freed, and $10 if he wasn't, if he was, taken back in shackles. So it was essentially a $5 bribe for every case for the judge if he decided in favor of the slave owner. So this is, it's ridiculous, really. Also violates the Constitution, but it's a side note. So the North, large sections of the North, go nuts over this law, and they refuse to follow it. You basically have a bunch of state laws that amount to nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act, where they refuse. They pass laws where federal slave catchers, I guess you'd call them, or officials who are engaged in this activity can't use local jails. Well, they didn't have federal jails at this time period, so what are you going to do? And basically just tried to stop any sort of enforcement of this law for the South. It also increases, to a huge extent, the use of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is one of the cool cloak and dagger type stories in American history, and it's basically a series. It had all these railroad uh, symbolism or metaphors to it. So there's conductors were individuals who would help slaves flee to Canada, and the secret hiding places would be stations on the Underground Railroad. And the most famous conductor is in this picture right now. Take a chance to see who you think it is. And she's right here. This is Harriet Tubman. She was called Moses. Abraham Lincoln ends up calling her General Tubman. No, it was John Brown. I'm sorry. John Brown calls her General Tubman. But she might be the coolest woman in the history of the United States. This is a painting of Harriet Tubman engaging in one of the most amazing acts, again, in American history. Because here's her story. She was born a slave. At the age of, and I want to say it's 12, maybe 13 years old, she is beaten so severely by an overseer that she suffers brain damage. Right, her skull is shattered, and shards of skull pierce her brain, but she gets no medical treatment. So not only does she not die, but when she heals, she has brain damage. And the brain damage manifests itself, and she develops something called narcolepsy, where she could be walking down the road, and then all of a sudden, bam, she's unconscious in a sleep-like state. And that could last minutes or hours, and there's really no warning. So she's to go through the rest of her life suffering from narcolepsy. So she runs away. I forget. I think she's a little bit older, of a teenager when she escapes. Now, when she's free, her husband is still in bondage, and so she goes down. She sneaks back into the South to free him, and she discovers that he has remarried. He's living with another woman, and so she doesn't free him. She can't be too happy about that. But you would think, all right, now she's just going to go off to Canada again and move on with her life. And it's a cool story of a woman with brain damage who's able to escape slavery and then snuck back in and snuck out. But she doesn't stop there. She actually goes to another plantation where her elderly parents were at. I guess they couldn't have been too old, maybe middle-aged at the time. And she sneaks them out. Word gets back, so she gets her way to Canada or the North or wherever she's at, that she's able to sneak out slaves. And so relatives basically go up to her and say, "Hey, would you sneak out my relatives?" She ends up making several trips. I think it's in the somewhere in the 12, 13 trip range where she's sneaking down, and she ends up freeing and bringing to freedom over 300 people. Now you got to remember, this is the 1840s, 1850s. She's a woman with brain damage who is herself an escaped slave. She's black, and yet she's sneaking all around the South, freeing people. And this is an amazing story. So then the Civil War rolls around, and you're like, all right, cool, good for Harriet Tubman. She has lived already a fantastic life. Just chill out in the North and wait out the war. But she doesn't do that. She then turns into a spy, and she sneaks back into the South, and she acts like a slave. So she's undercover, incognito, not Richie Incognito. We know he would fan hers, but she's incognito, and she takes down information on troop movements and supplies for the South, and then she would sneak up back north and give this secret information to help the Northern armies crush the South. I mean, she's almost like a superhero, and I'm awaiting. At some point, Hollywood has to tell her story, a biography of her story, because it's like an action movie. It's just every scene is her doing something amazing. So here's another picture of Harriet Tubman here, down here. She wasn't a looker, but I guess if you're a badass, that'll go a long way. So there's a couple other cool pictures I wanted to show you guys from the Underground Railroad. So this would be a station. So you can see it's like an attic bedroom, just slanted roof. And if you move this bed, so you close this door and you move this bed, it's just wide enough where you don't see the door at all. So this would be a good place to hide escaped slaves. Now, how do you get them from house to house on their way to Canada? Well, you sneak them in here. And so a couple people could be crammed in here. It's almost like plywood, right? A plywood box. And then you put hay and cotton and whatever else you're growing in front of this. And so when the slave catcher or the posses that are looking for escaped slaves stop the cart, they may move a couple of these bags, but you're not going to see the hidden compartment here. Now, it's a horrible way to travel. It had to be hot as hell, cramped and dark, but you gotta make some sacrifices to flee to freedom. This is just another a clearer version of that picture. You can see there's General Tubman there on the far left. Suddenly want to check to see if this one was still alive. Alright, so what's the U.S. look like after the Compromise of 1850? You've got the free territory is in purple, slave territory is in this yellowish color, then you have the territory that we got from Mexico, Utah Territory and Mexico Territory. We'll talk about the Gadsden Purchase soon enough. So the election of 1852, the battle of dudes who like to stick their hands in their shirts. You have General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, on the left. It doesn't look like he fussed too much at the buffet. He's quite obese. And then you have Franklin Pierce, who looks kind of like a pedophile, on the right. Franklin Pierce runs on the Democrat ticket. He defeats General Winfield Scott on the Whig ticket. And this is the end of the Whig Party. Now, you're probably wondering, hey, Enright, you didn't talk at all about President Zachary Taylor. It's because he sucked. He didn't do anything. Millard Fillmore, we barely talked about at all because he doesn't do anything either. Franklin Pierce, for the next 4 years, doesn't do jack. And then the president after him, James Buchanan, doesn't do jack. So there's a series of very weak, very useless presidents in between Polk, not including Polk. Remember, I love that guy. Between Polk and Abe Lincoln. So you get Polk, who's the president from 44 to 48. who was awesome, and then President Lincoln, who was president from 1860 to 1865. But there's a 12-year period there where you have four extremely useless presidents, and that is also a cause of the Civil War. Is you didn't have a guy who had the personality to stop this. Andrew Jackson wouldn't settle for any of this stuff that was going on in the 1850s, and you'll find out that Abe Lincoln didn't settle for any of this stuff. So, it's one of the tragedies of this era is that America really suffered from a lack of leadership at the top. This is just another map of the United States, and it talks about what's free, what's slave state, and why. Right? And so here in Illinois, we were always free, basically. Ever since the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it said that we would be free. Here you get this area, the Louisiana Purchase was free because of they were north of 36 degrees 30. Then you have Indian Territory. So Oklahoma was really never even supposed to be a state. It was just supposed to be this Indian island in the middle of nowhere. And then you have the whole popular sovereignty. You have California, which comes in, so there's really no decision made. They decided for themselves. All right. It says here, expansionists stirring south of the border. So remember that concept of manifest destiny from the last chapter? Well, it's still going strong here, right? And it worked out so well for us because we beat the ever-living crap out of Mexico, took half of Mexico, and increased our own holdings by a third. So America is looking now elsewhere, right? We already went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. What's next? Well, we start to look south. Specifically, we start to look in Central America because now that we control the Atlantic Ocean, now that we can starting to control the Pacific Ocean, we're going to want to get our stuff right between the two. The Transcontinental Railroad was still being constructed, and there's only one line. So the best way to transport goods is still by boat. But if you want to get from New York to San Francisco or vice versa, you're going to have to go all the way around South America. So why not find a shortcut? And the shortcut is going to be Central America. And so the United States and the country was called New Granada at the time. It later gets the name Colombia. Before they were into cocaine, they were into making dealings with the United States. And we formed the Gadsden Manifesto. I'm sorry, we'll talk about that in a second. But we form an agreement here at the bottom. It's not the Gadsden Manifesto. I forget what the name of it is. But we form an agreement, and we start to make early plans for transit across the isthmus there. And there was a couple. They didn't really have a clear-cut idea. They were thinking about maybe a little mini canal here that hooked up with this lake, and then you could just go over land. Later on, 50, 60 years later, is when they actually dig the Panama Canal here. But they didn't know. They weren't thinking. They didn't really have the technology to dig a huge canal in between the two oceans. But they wanted to have a spot available where they could eventually do something. Now, Cuba. We got to talk about Cuba because this does involve the Gadsden Manifesto. South wanted it, right? Cuba was growing crap loads of sugar. It was very, very profitable, and Spain sucked. And so South wanted it because it would be a guaranteed slave area. You could break it up into several states. This would give the South, if not an equality in the Senate, but actually perhaps a majority in the Senate if they were able to get Cuba. So President, I can't remember which president it was. I think it was Pierce. He issues kind of orders for the American ministers to Spain, England, and France to try and secretly come up with some sort of deal or recommendation how to get Cuba. And they do. And they think that Spain, England, and France would be okay if the United States purchased Cuba for $120 million. This is going to be a lot of money, right? I mean, we purchased all of California and the New Mexico territories for 15 mil. What did we get? I think we got Florida for 10 mil or something like that. And now we're going to get Cuba for 120 mil, for 10 times as much. So it just goes to show you how everybody agreed how profitable at this time period Cuba was. Now it's not worth jack. This secret agreement or recommendation gets leaked, and Northern Free Soilers, so people from the Free Soil Party, people who used to be Whigs because the Whig Party now is not dead, they discover this and they get pissed, and so they bitch and moan about it because they don't want the South to have more slave states. So even though it would have been good for our country to get this land from an economic standpoint, they didn't want it because it would mean more slave states. Asia. They just kind of throw this in here. This page in the book, it feels grafted on. It is grafted on, but it's from this time period. It does deal with manifest destiny to a certain degree. And let's face it, in the 20th century, we're going to have a lot of dealings with China and Japan. So this is kind of the start. Treaty of Wanhua, 1844, is the first formal diplomatic agreement between the United States and China. We have had a ton since then. The most important thing you got to know from this is that the United States gets most favored nation status. So if China secures a sweet deal with any other nation, then America also gets that deal. Then you get the Treaty of Kanagawa, 1854 with Japan. And this is where Commodore Matthew Perry, not of Friends fame, opens up Japan to Western consular relations. Here's what I mean by that. Right around 1600 or so, Japan isolates itself from the rest of the world. And for the next 250 years, they were extremely xenophobic, extremely isolationist. If one of their Japanese citizens is on a boat, like a whaling vessel or something like that, and a hurricane hits, and they end up having to land in a foreign country, they're not allowed back into Japan. If a foreigner shipwrecks in Japan, they are not allowed to leave. So they completely close themselves off from the rest of the world for 250 years. So along comes Matthew Perry in 1853, shows up an American warship, and basically says, look, we're going to start dealing business with you, and if you don't like it, we'll blow you up. I'll be back in a year to hear your answer. And he shows up the next year with even more ships and more guns, and he kind of has some fancy gifts that are American inventions, and Japan reluctantly agrees. You gotta remember too, Japan, by having 250 years of forced isolation or forced self-isolation, they really were a very backward nation at this time period. The rest of the world, they're sharing technology, either purposefully or if you're like Samuel Slater, jocking blueprints and stuff like that, illegally downloading technical aspects, intellectual property. It's just not happening in Japan. So the technology in Japan is from the 1600s, whereas the rest of the world is now in the mid 1800s. And so Japan realizes that, yeah, we better open up, otherwise we're just going to become slaves. All right, railroads. So here's what's going on here. The United States wants to build a transcontinental railroad so we can get goods to the Pacific coast, to San Francisco. You have all those people living in California. It's not so much that we want to get their gold, because at the end of the day, it doesn't turn out to be a hell of a lot of gold. But we definitely want to have access to harbors on the Pacific Ocean. How do you do that? This is a monumental task, right? I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of miles of track across hostile lands, across the Rocky Mountains, right? I mean, it's a huge mountain range, very high peaks. This is going to cost a ton of money. It's going to take a long time. So they kind of just figure out, like, well, what's the easiest route? If you look, the Rocky Mountains are very tall in the United States, but when you get down into Mexico, they're much lower in elevation, which is stupid on our part that we didn't see this in 1848 when we formed the Treaty of, that's right, Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so what we end up doing is purchasing some land in northern Mexico for $10 million. And this would allow us to have a railroad route that would almost hug the border with Mexico there. It would be much easier to create because the mountains are lower there. The South is ecstatic at this because if you have a southern railroad, This means that you're going to have cities that pop up in the South that are going to deal with this, and trade to the Pacific coast is going to actually funnel to the South. This is something that the South really never had, right? Because the transportation network prior to this had been almost entirely a northern thing. Think Erie Canal, think the enlarging Chicago on the lakefront there. All that other transportation stuff had occurred in the north, and there really wasn't a whole lot going on in the south, so they were very, very excited for the Gadsden Purchase. They really pushed for it hard because they felt that the Transcontinental Railroad then would be built in the south. And this was the proposed route of the Southern Railroad from Los Angeles to Houston. You can see how it basically hugs the border with Mexico. And then in order to do that, here in New Mexico territory, they had to purchase this blue area from Mexico. So this is the Gadsden Purchase, 1853. Stephen Douglas, our guy from Illinois, screws it up though. And he screws it up in a very Chicago way. Right? Think of the Chicago machine politics. Think of all the corruption we've had in the last, 50 years with the Dailies and with Blagojevich and with George Ryan, Jesse Jackson Jr. I mean, all these politicians that have tried to enrich themselves uh, and wronged the people of Illinois at the same time. Well, Stephen Douglas may be the father of that. He owns a ton of land on the lakefront, actually very, very close to where Mount Carmel is right now. Perhaps he even owned land where Mount Carmel sits at. This is right before the building of the school. He also owns a ton of stock in railroad companies in and around Chicago. Because of this, he wants to get rich, right? So what the best way to get rich is for the Transcontinental Railroad to begin, or at least go through, Chicago. Right? So then that's going to increase his real estate holdings and his stock holdings. So he doesn't want a southern Transcontinental Railroad. He wants a northern Transcontinental Railroad. But how's he going to do this? Because obviously they already purchased the Gadsden Purchase. That's a stupid sentence. And he needs the South to vote for this, right? Because you still have a ton of Southern senators. So his bright idea is to repeal the Missouri Compromise. So to get rid of the Missouri Compromise and to create the notion of popular sovereignty in Nebraska territory. His idea was that you were going to cut the Nebraska territory in half into Kansas and Nebraska. And he figured that people from Missouri, which was a slave state, would migrate west into Kansas, which was directly west of Missouri, and that Kansas would become a slave state. Meanwhile, people from Iowa, which is directly east of Nebraska, would migrate to Nebraska, and since Iowa was a free state, that Nebraska would come in as free. This was his bright idea. He felt that this would be palatable to the South because the South would get an unexpected slave state in the North. And he was right. Right? The people in the South are like, hell yeah, we're going to get rid of that Missouri Compromise, and now we can actually have more slave states in the Great Plains region. So it was a gamble on his part. It was a gamble because he wanted to enrich himself, and he also wanted to increase the prestige, wealth, and popularity of Chicago. Now he does that. I mean, this at the end of the day, he gets what he wants from this. He does make a ton of money, and let's face it, Chicago is one of the greatest cities in the country because of the railroad network that's built during this time period. So you and I may be doing what we're doing in Chicago right now because of this very corrupt decision that Stephen Douglas makes. So that's how politics works in Chicago. There's another picture of the little giant there, resting his midget knuckles on that table. So he introduces a bill to divide Nebraska territory into two territories and to repeal the Missouri Compromise. You can imagine people are going to be very bitter, very angry about this. And so debate took a long time, very hostile, that people are getting beat up and guns drawn in Congress. I mean, it was a very violent time really to be a politician in America. But eventually, it's passed. So here's what you get. They're gonna extend the Transcontinental Railroad on this northern route, the Union Pacific Railroad. Union Pacific's still around today. And this is going to be now open to slavery through popular sovereignty. The idea, again, was that Missouri was a slave state, so people are going to migrate to Kansas Territory with their slaves. And here, people are going to migrate without their slaves because they don't have slaves. And Nebraska Territory is going to be free. Kansas Territory is going to be slave. This is a departure from the Missouri Compromise, which stated that anything below this line is slave, whether they want it or not, and anything above this line is free, whether they want it or not. Last slide of the lecture.
Mr. Voda, if you are in the building, would you please come to the school office? Mr. Voda is in the school office.
You have here in 1848 the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the Mexican-American War. Taylor defeats Cass and Van Buren for the presidency. You get the California Gold Rush there in 1849. Millard Fillmore becomes president after Taylor's death in 1850. Obviously, you get the Compromise of 1850. You got Franklin Pierce, defeating Old Fuss and Feathers, hand in pocket Winfield Scott for the presidency. You know what he had in his hand in the pocket? There had to be like a bag of pork rinds or something in there. 1853, Gadsden purchased from Mexico. And then you get that Commodore Perry opens Japan in 1854. The Austin Manifesto talks about getting Cuba. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is from 1854. And the birth of the Republican Party, which we will talk about next chapter. And that's